Bite-sized learning, we will go ahead and get started. So I'm Dr. Kelly Irwin. I am in my paid job, I guess is the right way to say it. I'm the Director of Enablement and Education Solutions at learning.com. We're a K-12 digital literacy company. We focus on helping students build healthy and proficient relationships with technology. In my non-paid role, I am the Professional Development Co-Chair for TxDLA, as well as the President-elect for 25-26. So excited so much today for our conversation. My cohort is not with us today. She is vacationing, but Dr. Rhonda Blackburn is the Chief Information Officer and obviously my Professional Development Co-Chair here at TxDLA. You are attending the Bite-Sized Learning webinar for today, in case you didn't know that's what it's called. And we do provide a series of these free webinars once a month. They're always on the second Wednesday of the month, and they are always at 12 o'clock Central. So if you're interested in attending more of our free webinars, you can always go to the TxDLA website. That's txdla.org. Look for the Learn button and it'll expand for you and you can see our bite-sized learning webinars. Like I said, we do these monthly and we are kind of trying to build out the calendar a little bit more ahead of time. So always keep an eye on that as well as our socials where we post information about the webinars there too. Today's session, it's June 11th. We're going to be looking at designing for accessibility and how that really supports all students beyond those who specifically need accommodations. Next month in July, we're looking at how to energize and keep folks engaged in the digital world. So be sure to jump over to the Bite-Sized Learning page and get registered for next month's webinar as well. Couple of things, save the date. Wanted to let you all know that we do have our fall leadership workshop scheduled October 15th through the 17th. That's going to be in South Padre. We'll have more details available for that soon, but definitely go ahead and mark those dates on your calendar. As well as, I know it seems weird to talk about things going on in 2026 when it's just summertime right now, but go ahead and mark your calendars and save the date for March 23rd through 26th in Galveston. That will be our in-person conference. We also just established the dates for the virtual conference, and that will be a couple of weeks later in April. So we'll be sharing out all of that information again on our socials. We'll be updating the TxDLA website with more information, but definitely get those two dates set on your calendar and we look forward to you joining us for those learning experiences as well. We're in a Zoom meeting. I think we've all done this before, but just so you know, we are recording today's session. The chat window, feel free to keep that open. Chit chat along the way throughout the conversation today. If you have specific questions that come up for Kristin, please put those in the chat and we'll save some time at the end of today's session for us to talk through and try to answer some of those questions. You all are joining us on mute today. Please remain on mute so that there's no background or extraneous noises that interrupt today's session. And now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Kristin to us, to you, to us all. And Kristin, I'm going to pass it over to you to start the session. All right, I have stopped sharing. You should be able to take over and share your screen.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for that nice introduction. And I'm very happy to be here with everyone. And even though I'm not in Texas, it's good to see my Texas friends again, even if it's virtually. So today I am, my goal today is just to share some information with you and think differently about accessibility in the online environment, just coming at it from a different perspective. And because accessibility as a topic is so huge, we're going to just focus today on how to design to improve attention in the online environment. Through this conversation, we will even touch a little bit on some of the WCAG items to add to our learning. Okay, make sure you're all seeing the right screen. It looks like you are. This is our agenda. I'm planning to speak for about 30 minutes. I want to make sure we have time for questions and some discussion. We will just start by defining attention and looking at internal and external barriers to attending to information and how some disabling conditions do affect attention. We'll talk a little bit about how we can design for accessibility to enhance attention, and then consider how some of those very specific ideas relate also to WCAG. And I'll explain what WCAG is, although I'm sure you all know, at least most of you, and some of you probably more than I know. I'll also share some resources I've used to put this together and my contact information in case there's any questions afterwards. So we know that human beings cannot attend to everything around them all at the same time. We have to focus on certain items at the expense of others. So on the screen here, I have a definition from the American Psychological Association's dictionary about what is attention. It's a state in which cognitive resources are focused on certain aspects of the environment rather than others, and our central nervous system is in the state of readiness to respond to whatever the stimulation is around us. So we know that much of the research around attention examines factors that influence attention and also how our brains work to select and process that information. Because of that research, we know that our past experiences affect what we pay attention to. And we also know that attention can be captured by changing the stimulus in the environment, adding or removing information, repeating information or contrasting it, and by creating novelty. So attention is described in psychology, and it's also a factor in instructional design. Some models, more than others, call out the importance of learner attention. The community of inquiry framework, which I'm sure many of you are already aware of, is a well-known theory for online learning. And on this diagram, I'm showing 3 circles and how they overlap as part of that framework. It's looking at teacher presence, social presence, and it proposes that both of those create an environment where cognitive presence can thrive. Central to that framework is the ability of the learner to be cognitively present and or for the instructor to find ways to capture their attention when it does wander. So what causes us to lose attention? Well, my phone is a distraction. It'll ring if someone's calling me. I get pings every time there's a text, and I'm getting a lot of weather alerts at this time of the year. I need to focus on something. If I need to focus on something, I can silence my phone, put it in a drawer, just move it to another location, and then I can focus. It's a distraction that is external to my body, and I have a certain amount of control over it. But what about when distractions are internal? So everyone at one time or another has something happening in their body or their minds that takes their attention away from their work, their learning, or their interactions with others. A headache might be one example of something most of us may have experienced. It's something that's happening within my body, and I don't have immediate control over it. Sometimes the headache might be mild, um, but it can still affect how long I want to look at a computer or how long I might read a book. Our eyes might be sensitive to light. We may spend time away from electronics, maybe move to a darkened room. And if I have a headache on a day that I'm doing research, maybe I will accommodate that. Maybe I'll change what I'm doing that day. But if I have a lot of Zoom meetings back to back, maybe I can't change those. And I might find my attention wandering. I might not remember everything that happens in those meetings unless I take really good notes. So at this moment, I'm thinking, let's go ahead and put in the chat. If you can think of other internal barriers or disabling conditions that you've run into, either yourself or maybe something that a student you were working with ran into. And I don't know that I can see the chat when I'm presenting. Let me look. I think I can. So yeah, take a moment and think about students you've worked with, situations you've run into. Yes, not enough sleep, anxiety, worrying about a loved one. Yeah, so many options. Tinnitus, the weather, and the weather for some of us can cause a headache if you have that lovely experience. Um, oh boy, house catching on fire. Yeah, so some of these are external, some of them are internal. I do notice even the external ones, a lot of us don't have control over those. But yeah, emotional distress, things that weigh on our minds, right? Okay, I'm going to continue moving on then. So we did that. And as we can see in the chat, there are so many different types of situations that end up being medical conditions or disabilities. And again, I refer to those sometimes as internal distractions, things that are happening within us that make it hard to pay attention. And you may have noticed that we're getting to this topic of disability in a very roundabout way. We're actually starting with the functional challenge of paying attention, of being able to focus. And this is really important because functional challenges cross many different diagnoses. Um, if you've ever worked with a counselor, or if any of you are counselors who work with students to set up accommodations, you may have heard people say that the diagnosis isn't really the most important thing. And that's because the accommodation that is provided, the intention is to address that barrier or remove that barrier, mitigate it. Sometimes we can't remove it. And so many different disabilities can affect focus. And that's what I'm showing on the slide here. So on the slide is a table with 5 columns. We talked about a headache. That's one of the columns. I know from my work and working with students that we have many students who have a concussion, whether it's from sports or car accident, and that can also lead to various issues, but certainly ability to focus or pay attention. Disorders that affect executive functioning is my third column here. And in that one, we're talking about anything from, ADHD, some autism, there's various diagnoses. Cancer treatment is another situation. If you've ever worked with a student who's going through cancer treatment, whether it's the treatment or the side effects of the medicine, you will see that that can affect trouble focusing. And I noticed many people in the chat mentioned how many of us in society today are dealing with mental health issues. Anxiety and depression and others can certainly affect our cognitive abilities and affect our ability to focus. So again, you see why sometimes a counselor focusing on disability accommodations will say, let's not get too hung up on what the title of that diagnosis is, because it's the functional challenge that we really want to address. And remember, if you're not aware, that accommodations are after the fact, and our focus today really is how can we proactively design, not just for students with disabilities, but really for anyone that's going through a situation, whether they're tired or just anything that could be affecting their ability to focus. So finding solutions based on the examples that we've discussed so far, it's probably safe to say many learners are already doing they're showing up with cognitive multitasking going on. When they arrive to our digital classrooms or our online learning spaces. And for students who are already struggling to coordinate and control their attention, we want to avoid overwhelming them. And we want to help them stay focused on the essential learning objectives. By helping our learners stay focused or find their focus, we're going to increase the likelihood that they'll take in the information that we're providing, they'll store that information, and be able to recall it later when they need it. So how do we do this? Solutions can be found in a few places, and many of them are their own trainings. So we're not going to get deep into any of these, but I do want to outline a few. We can talk about general learning frameworks that most instructors will learn in their educational background and keeping up with best practices. There are industry recognized design and evaluation frameworks for online learning. And there are international digital accessibility standards, which now are being required by federal law, federal regulations. And so I've kind of grouped them on this slide like this. We have learning frameworks. An example of that might be the Universal Design for Learning, or industry recognized frameworks that focus on not just designing, but how you're evaluating. And a couple of those organizations are listed here. For example, Quality Matters, I know, has a module focused on accessibility, and the digital accessibility standards that are required or about to be required by federal regulations. I will be happy to share this PowerPoint so that everyone can get those links if they need them. Let's take them one at a time for a moment and just talk about why these can be helpful. So the Universal Design for Learning guidelines are a tool for implementing UDL. The aim here is to design the environment rather than to situate the problem as a perceived deficit in the learner. That's from their website. And so this is a specific framework that takes into account how the learner is going to regulate their affective, cognitive, and behavioral processes. And so when we're talking about attending, which is a challenge for distraction, the guidelines do offer some potential potential solutions. So vertically, the principles that we're talking about here are engagement, representation, and action and expression. And I do like that they start out by saying designing multiple means of engagement, designing multiple means of representation, and designing multiple means of action and expression. That goes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is any way that you can capture attention will help that issue of struggling to focus. And so when you're providing multiple means of sharing information, that's a way that we can learn to capture our learners' attention. And I know so many of you are already doing these things. Again, I just am trying to come at it from a slightly different perspective. So let's go back to our example where we were talking about headaches. And we were talking about a few conditions: headaches, concussions, disorders that affect executive functioning, cancer treatment, anxiety, and depression. All of those had the functional challenge of, of focusing or paying attention. So just looking at a couple of items from the UDL guidelines as a solution, let's see how some of those guidelines would support or capture attention. If we're looking at consideration 1.2, this is in the column of representation. We're talking about ways that you can support multiple ways to perceive the information. And some of the examples they give on how to do that is adding visual information, adding images, graphics, animations, or video or text. Again, this is going to help capture that learner's attention. For any non-visual information, the standard is to also provide text or spoken description for all of those things. This does a couple of things here. We are at the same time that we're trying to interest the learner and represent the information in multiple ways, we are also making sure to be inclusive of someone who may not be able to see, who has low vision, they may be blind, they may be hard of hearing, or they may be deaf. But in all of that, another line of work that's happening here is we're capturing attention. We're bringing that focus to the learning that is most relevant. Another consideration 1.1 is supporting opportunities to customize the display of information. So again, we're talking about ways that are going to customize the experience a little bit for experience. Maybe they can customize the font or the size. If we're giving them information that can be adjusted, if it's not going to be adjusted right away, we can capture their attention by not overloading the screen. Even what you're seeing today, for those of you who are looking at the presentation, This slide, for example, has a lot of information. I typically would not do this in a classroom with students. But line spacing, character width, background color, text colors, all of these ways that we present information visually are going to really help the learner focus on the essential information. Under the action and expression section, consideration of, which is the one I'm talking about here, is 6.3, how we organize the information will help with working memory. Earlier, I mentioned that we don't want to overload our person that's already struggling to coordinate their attention. And this is another example of the guidelines from UDL that also can help someone who's struggling to focus. So instead of having line after line after line of text, finding ways to group that information or chunk that information for later access is going to help that memory, the working memory, not get overloaded. Using graphic organizers, checklists, guides for note taking, all of those things are going to help for someone who's struggling. And I mentioned that if I have a headache and I'm in Zoom meetings all day, I will actually increase how I'm doing note taking because I know that my ability to recall that information later may be difficult. So I want to give myself the resources to help that happen. So in a different format, I'm presenting a table here where there's a column talking about the UDL consideration, but I do want to compare that and link it actually to a couple of the principles that are in the web content accessibility guidelines. So before we get into that, for anyone who's not familiar, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, are now being required for Title II organizations, and Title III organizations like private universities have a different reason that it's now going to be required starting next year. And that is because if they're bringing in funds from the U.S. Health and Human Services Department, that organization has specifically adopted the web and mobile and kiosk section from Title II. So over this year and into next year, if you're not already aware of it, many universities and colleges across the country are working to try to bring themselves in alignment with WCAG. If you start by looking at the WCAG standards, it can be extremely overwhelming. So one of the reasons I thought I would connect that today is to give another way of thinking about how all of these different guidelines and solutions out there really can come together when you focus on the functional challenge instead of just trying to read all of the UDL guidelines or read all of the WCAG guidelines. So staying with our example of talking about something that's stealing our ability to focus, we've already talked about certain considerations from UDL. We've talked about 1.2, supporting multiple ways to perceive information. 1.1, supporting opportunities to customize that display. And we've talked about 6.3, organizing our information and resources. Now, each of those actually do align with some very specific guidelines, very specific principles as well in WCAG. And each of them actually fall under the section that's about perceivable, how a person perceives their information. And so on the rows under each of these, where I have representation and the consideration for 1.2, supporting multiple ways to perceive information aligns with guideline 1.1 from WCAG. That is talking about text alternatives, including non-text alternatives and captions for your pre-recorded audio content. So this is just another moment for you to realize how many things crisscross when you're talking about accessibility. I will say that for that specific UDL consideration, there are other WCAG guidelines that match. But I definitely wanted you to walk away today feeling like, wow, okay, I learned how these connect. And now if I wasn't familiar, I do know a couple of the guidelines from WCAG as well. So principle number 1, perceivable, for WCAG, guideline 1.4 is really focusing on how we distinguish the information. And that aligns really well with the guideline from UDL, which is supporting opportunities to customize the display of information. This is where, if we provide videos, we want to, for example, a pre-recorded video of this presentation that someone is able to access a month from today. If they can adjust the volume and the speed of that video, they customize it to the needs that they have. If they want to slow down the video to be able to focus and process the information more, they can do that if we're providing that video with all of the settings that would be required by WCAG, for example. The third item that we talked about, consideration 6.3, and how we organize information and resources, that aligns with another principle from WCAG, talking about how the information is adaptable. And I really feel this falls under when you're thinking about, have I done the work I need to prepare for someone to use a screen reader? That is a really wonderful way to think about the information you have shared. When a person is using a screen reader, organizing the information using headings and avoiding a lot of extra spaces and random returns, other things that can confuse a screen reader, is really what you want to be doing that. So again, on this slide right here, it's just an opportunity to show that as you're learning about one or two of the considerations, you can often see how it will link to other standards. And again, all of it can be wrapped around one functional challenge like we're doing today. I feel like I've been talking really quickly. Let me see how I'm doing. So I think we're going to probably get done a little bit early. These are some of the resources though, so I'll take a moment and walk through why I picked some of these resources. Starting with what we did today, we were looking at the functional challenge of being able to pay attention or focus. My goal was to help you see that we have ways to proactively try to capture a person's attention. We also have ways to proactively ensure the information is inclusive. So whether it's how you're presenting it in text or visually, or how you're creating your activities for your learning session, there's a lot of resources on this page that can give you pieces to help with that. One of the things that I find very helpful, maybe because I learned it later in life, is understanding how to effectively write image descriptions and understanding how to describe things that I'm trying to put out in visual text. The American Federation for the Blind has some really good information on how to write effective image descriptions. And I'm going to skip a line on this slide. Another resource I go to for that information a lot is the Described and Captioned Media Program, which has a web page really dedicated to remote learning. This is really helpful if you're a person who uses PowerPoint images a lot. If you're using images, for example, that are conveying a hierarchy, and it's more than can be described in just one or two sentences. So when you're thinking of putting that information on a website or sharing it really broadly, how will you describe that same information for someone who needs it in a different format? Those are two of my favorite resources for that. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA.gov, does have a rule. There's a new rule that we're all, I'm sure many of you, working to accomplish compliance with. And on ADA.gov, they do have some web and they have some resources for that. And I also have that link here. The rule for Health and Human Services is also on this page. And again, that's really relevant for anyone who works at a private university. The rule itself is specific, but it does point you back to Title II of the ADA. So I do point that out because sometimes if you're in group chats and some of you are from different types of organizations, you may run into someone from a private university who will say that we don't have to comply with Title II right now. For any of you who are thinking about how this affects your learners when they're going to go out in the workforce, the Job Accommodation Network has a section called askjan.org, or for any of you who are, you're working yourselves and you have questions about what types of workplace accommodations could be helpful, there is a section on their website that's dedicated just to attentiveness and concentration. I will say many of the resources on that page have to do with different apps that can be downloaded. And some of them are really helpful, but there are some other types of resources as well. I find that really helpful whether I'm working with students or employees, because it's just the way it's written is very real world, very easy to digest. We already talked a little bit about universal design for learning. I know it's not the only framework out there, and many of you are using other options. I do tend to look at it, especially when I'm talking about accessibility and inclusion, just because they have so many options that focus on how information is presented in an inclusive manner, and it does overlaps in so many ways with WCAG. And which brings me to the last resource on this page, which is part of WCAG's group, the WebAIM. They have tutorials for staff training. There's many, actually, lots of tutorials there. But I do like this one in particular, which is focusing on training your own staff. So they have some short videos for that. Okay, I think if you're all comfortable with that, we'll start with questions a little early, and because I have seen some come into the chat, and I think to do that, I'll probably stop presenting. But before I do that, I will share, I think one of the easiest ways to get in touch with me if you do have questions is on LinkedIn. For those of you who don't have LinkedIn, I will also make sure that we share an email. But this is my LinkedIn address, linkedin.com/in/KA Malloy, Malloy. So I'm going to go back a slide, and then I'm going to stop sharing, and we can start a little bit of a conversation, which is actually my favorite part of presenting. So let's do that. Okay. Let me see. Okay, so I'm going to move over where I can see the questions. Kelly, did you want to be a part of questions, or is there anything you'd like to do with
So,
questions?
one thing I will say is I noticed that somewhere in the process, someone posted asking about access to the resources. Kristin, you already said you would share those out with us. So if you'll
Mhm.
do that afterwards, that's great. Then we can make sure we get those resources posted out where everybody has access to them.
Okay, I think that that's wonderful. And what I'll do is, Kelly, I'll just email it to you, and then I'm going to email it as just an unprotected PowerPoint. And then if anyone needs the information in any other format, you can just go ahead and let me know that. So,
Great.
okay.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. I have to say, Kristen, no matter how many times I sit through a session or have a conversation or read something about accessibility, I feel like I uncover just another little golden nugget along the way. And so I guess my first question to you is, how do we go about managing the reality of time and knowledge and experience with all of the things that we should be doing
Mhm.
to the benefit of our learners? How do we find that balance?
It's a good question, and it's just I think I feel the same every time I go to a training, especially when you bring in the technology element. And I was thinking this morning about an example I might use, but I won't go into it right now. But it was from when I went to the Accessing Higher Ground conference. So anything we're learning about in a bite-sized moment like today, people are doing workshops that are at least 1 hour long or week-long sessions. So I think the first thing to do is to recognize that we are there's not any one of us that will really know everything. Even people that are dedicating, even people with an ADA coordinator title, or if I'm an assistive technology person working in a disability services office, we are always learning. What I would say though, for the instructors in the room, for sure, I think that knowing your content and thoughtfully thinking about how you want to present and convey your content is really helpful, because when you can have time to reflect on um, the basics, right? These are my essential objectives in this lesson. Then when anyone comes to you and they say, I have a student with a very particular situation, your go-to, I think, would be, and please feel free to enter in the chat if you feel differently, but I think your go-to response can be, okay, I'm trying to convey this in this lesson. These are the essential components. So whether the question is about how are we assessing that knowledge, or how is the person accessing that knowledge, when you as a subject matter expert can say, well, this is what I'm really trying to get across, and I really want to know, did that student learn that information? That opens up the discussion with someone else, whether it's the counselor that's doing accommodations, or the student themselves, or someone helping you from the assistive technology world, that it gives us a place to go. And the equivalent is, when I'm working with someone on the employment side, I can say to the supervisor, or I can say to human resources, what are the essential components of this job? And that gives us all a starting place. So I think that's how I would keep from being overwhelmed, is first of all, know that you're not in it alone. And there's a piece that we're going to look to you for, and that's super helpful when you can help us describe that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Does
Mhm.
anybody else have a question? I think you should be able to come off mute. If not, raise your hand and we will take you off of mute. Or you can post in the chat. I did notice, while people are thinking of their questions, I did notice that a couple of people posted comments about being able to upload your images into, I'm going to assume, various LLMs.
Right.
In this particular case, they happen to mention ChatGPT to kind of get you started. The one thing that I personally will say about that is, while that's great, and I definitely start there for everything, remember your humanness, and don't take it for face value, right? So Kristin, do you have any
Mhm.
suggestions or comments tied to that?
I was thinking about what would I want to say about AI, and I will say that Chat GPT and all of these other wonderful things that are coming out are always worth it to look into. And I think in the world of accessibility, the key is going to be that you take the time to go back and check it. And it's funny, not that was the memory I was having of being at the Accessing Higher Ground conference, probably in, I want to say 2013 or 2014, where we were talking about using note-taking technology, and that's either automated, or whether you have a human who's listening in and that person is typing to provide live captioning, or whether you're using AI. And even back then, I believe that year it was something like 65% accurate. So now we're still more accurate when it comes just to the automatic note taking. But again, it's still so important to check it. Same with your images and your image descriptions. Make sure that it's specific enough to what you're doing. And actually, when I was preparing for this PowerPoint, I was trying to make sure I had alt images on alt text on all of my images, and some of them were wrong, even though they were stock images.
Mm.
The other thing I'm just fascinated with is the whole concept of AI hallucinations. So I think it's definitely great, and if you can find things that are going to help you be efficient at work, and just don't forget that it's all such new technology that there still are a lot of errors.
Thank you. We do have a few questions now that we've been chatting. We have a few questions that have popped in for us. So the first one is, do you have any strategies that we can use to actually share with our students? One of the examples, like, do you have a folder with student strategies? Or
Mhm.
have a folder to give to students with specific strategies or any kind of tips like that that we can use?
I think that some of the best things, I'm coming from the instructor side. Some of the best things that instructors can have is things that are specific to their work, like checklists. Really learning how to use your whether it's Blackboard or Canvas or D2L. Really learning how, because so many of them have so many features about organizing information and clarity. And I think, especially when we're talking about focus and attention, clarity and keeping track of things, organizing is just crucial. If you've ever worked with a student who has executive functioning challenges and maybe they struggle with how to prioritize work, when you can provide a checklist, and I know it's extra work. I've taught classes myself where I was like, I'm going to provide a checklist for every week, and here's your reading, and here's your this, and it is definitely extra work. And I'm not saying that's what you should do, but I think anytime you can put that thought into it, whether it's you know emails where you have templates and you send them out as a reminder or something you're using on the discussion board, but as 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 opposed to trying to be specific about, this is for my students who have ADHD, this is for my students who have this
Mm.
diagnosis. And that's really what I want you to take away from this meeting today, is that don't get too wrapped up in the actual diagnosis, if unless someone is asking you to do that, right? But otherwise, thinking about, how can I help people focus? How can I keep my information clear? That is going to go so far because it crosses so many different conditions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Mhm.
Next question. Any tips or resources for working with students who are low vision or blind? And that would be tips for faculty, people maybe who are supporting the staff, any accommodations, tutoring. This particular question is specific to math, but maybe you
Mhm.
can answer on a broader level as well as the math.
That's a good question. I did put the American Federation for the Blind. I think that there are often more local resources, or your Texas Workforce Commission, your rehab, or maybe just working with your disability services office to see who they know. Because even so, let's say if I'm faculty and I want to help another faculty member, remember, the resource office is there as a resource to everyone in some capacity. And I know when I was that person, even though I was officially working to provide accommodations to the students, I always knew that working with faculty to help them understand various situations was part of my job, actually. So, and we get so many wonderful resources when we go to AHEAD conferences, and other ADA national, the national coordinators conferences. The You might be surprised how much that's there at your college or university, if you speak to them first. So I think I would go there. There's also the National Deaf Center for, I think you were talking about low vision or blind,
Mm-hmm.
um, but they're a great organization when you're talking about hearing. Um, and then, because it's specific to math, I'd have to think about it and check some of my resources. But again, one thing you may or may not be aware of is the disability service professionals at your organization. And if they're working with the national organization, ahead.org, there is a national listserv. So I, as a member of that, can go on today and say, hey, I have a faculty member looking for a great resource that has to do with teaching math to someone who's low vision or blind. And within a day or so, I'm probably going to get quite a few responses as well.
Oh,
So
that's great.
definitely
Yeah.
don't be afraid to ask those resources at your universities and colleges.
All right, wonderful. We only have one more question.
Okay.
So we'll we'll end with sort of pinging you with that one. So any tips for best resources for closed captioning videos and ensuring accuracy? That's something we've really struggled with too here at learning.com
Mhm.
is the speed with which we need these translated. This person specifically said, looking at a program that is online and has hours worth of videos. So I feel the pain on this question myself. So any tips for closed captioning?
Yeah, and I have done the same, in the work I do, providing my own trainings. When I worked at Western Governors University, I would create my own videos, and I played around with everything Camtasia and creating something in YouTube and bringing it over here to test it and make it, in and out of different resources. I think one of the best things I can say, so I'll take it to two steps here. Working proactively, everything you can do to provide yourself with a script, to some extent, is really helpful on the back end, because you might have so many things written out that you can work on those captioning. And yes, if you want them to be grammatically correct with punctuation, um, when you're doing it post recording and you're trying to go back, um, I have heard some schools that do. I don't want to assume they're paying, but a lot of them have maybe a paid position with a student intern, collaborating with your IT folks to see what student interns they are bringing in. Just there's often some of those, because working at a community college for many years, it's not like we had huge budgets. And so a lot of times, if you could reach out to the different groups, like your whoever teaches business, is there someone who needs an internship? Things like that is I would do that if I had some big projects, like a very specific library that I knew was going to take a while and I wanted to get it up. Um, as far as ongoing work, again, maybe looking for an intern or something where you have, or volunteers. And I definitely have heard, I think it was at a head conference, of some organizations that would ask for volunteers. You just have to be careful you don't have existing paid positions. So
Mhm.
you don't want to look like you're trying to hire someone to do something for free when other people at your same organization are getting paid to do it. So
That's a good call out. Thank you.
yes.
Marjorie has a comment. Would
Okay.
love to have a video that shows a screen reader reading an accessible document or course page and reading a page that is not accessible because it's really hard for people to understand the
Mhm.
why and the how of accessibility and the impact that a screen reader can make or can't make depending upon the issues that the screen reader itself runs into. Any suggestions on that? A place to go to find a video like that?
I haven't looked that up specifically. If you're not sure if that's what you want to do, you can actually use a free thing like NVIDIA, and I can make sure I share some of those free resources. And actually, I believe my computer, I think if you have a Windows, I'm not as familiar with Apple. So those of you who use Apple, um, I believe we have a built-in read aloud. So I've done that when I've had to update a web page or I've created something and then actually just run it through
Mm-hmm.
your own read aloud. What you'll find is if you haven't tagged everything appropriately, it'll just the voice that's reading will be skipping all over. It may read something at the bottom of the page first because I had heading one, and then your information at the top of the page didn't have any direction at all. So that experience I think is really helpful for us to try individually. And I would actually encourage you to just download some free software and just try your own material before hunting around too much on YouTube. But if you're trying to share it with someone else, I guess I would probably go to YouTube and look that up. I don't personally have one that I know of that I would share right now.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. And like I said, I learned something new every time I sit through any type of accessibility training. So this was fantastic, Kristen. I greatly appreciate it. Can you give me a thumbs up? Can everybody see my screen again? Are we sharing accurately? Perfect.
Mhm.
Thank you. I want to not only thank Kristen for this amazing session, but thanking our partners because we couldn't bring sessions like this to everybody for free. Without them, we couldn't have our conferences in-person, virtual, fall leadership. They really are how we keep this going, and so we greatly appreciate their partnership. A reminder, the bite-sized learning webinars are the second Wednesday of every month at noon Central Time, and you can find them on the TxDLA website under the Learn section. We have something fun happening this summer, just to kind of keep us all engaged and help us learn a little bit more. So keep your eye on the TxDLA socials over the next week or so. We are hoping to launch our summer bingo challenge, and just kind of a fun way to engage, meet new people, get involved digitally, and connect and advance our professional growth. So keep an eye on the TxDLA socials. Again, we have our fall leadership workshop that I mentioned earlier. That'll be October 15th through 17th. So save those dates. And then the conference itself in person in March of 2026. So 23rd through the 26th in Galveston. And then we'll have our virtual version April 14th and 15th. While these are always free and you're more than welcome to join any of our bite-sized learning webinars, we really do hope that you join TxDLA. We are an organization that really provides community. We have our knowledge base. And we look at trying to lead education through a digital lens. And when I say education, I mean anybody tied to digital learning, whether it's K-12, higher ed, government, military, businesses, anybody involved in digital learning. That really is our focus, whether you live in Texas or not. We always welcome that you join us for the membership piece as well as the learning piece. And I've mentioned it a couple of times, TxDLA, we are all over various socials. So please follow us, learn more from us, join us for our future bite-sized learning sessions and all of the other great learning experiences that we have. We hope you enjoyed today's session. Please have a wonderful rest of the afternoon. For those of you that are experiencing this fun summertime weather here in Texas,